strategy, I think the fault in your assumption is that there is a strategy, right? Which is essentially what my colleague here said. The reality is that, if you look at, actually, I did map this out, if you look at all those countries that you've mentioned, over the last 10 years, they have changed 2 heads of state, right? In Italy, over the last 10 years, we have changed 5 heads of state, right? And there's been radical shifts. So, you may have had, even in other countries, the same party appoint a new leader, whereas in Italy, we've had some very radical shifts in political leanings. And this is, again, regardless of who is leading the country. If you are having a constant change in leadership, and as a leader, you know that you are not going to be judged over your long-term results, you're going to be judged over what happens in the next 2 years, then you're not really incentivized to do any kind of a long-term planning. You're incentivized to bring some quick short-term solutions. In fact, the most recent Decreto Bollette, where they're refunding ETS, quick summary, the latest proposal to lower power prices in Italy is to refund ETS costs, which is essentially the cost that carbon producers have to pay to the European Union in extreme synthesis, is being refunded by the Italian government, which is going to bring down the power prices. And does that systemically lower power prices? No, but if it's implemented, will citizens and businesses see their power bill come down? Yes, absolutely. So it's a very short-termist approach, which is just like lots of other short-termist measures that the Italian government has done.
Yes, my next question was more going to be on the 2 main bottlenecks that I think I identified in the Italian system, which were the grid and the bureaucratic issues, but we touched on that, so maybe I'll move forward and I'll ask something a bit more in detail. And I sort of study these things as well as part of my degree, and when I look at Italy, I see this sort of self-feeding loop where you have high power prices, so investors are attracted because it looks like a promising market, and then they try to understand what's going on in Italy, and they realize that the bureaucracy is horrible, and the length of this project will take double or triple the amount of time that you would have in other countries, and so they're pushed away again. And this leaves sort of Italy in a limbo, in my opinion, where you don't have any real action taken, but it looks like a promising country. So I wanted to ask if this loop is actually there, in your opinion, and what can we do about it? What do you think we can do about it?
I think this loop exists if you are looking at pure play development, in the sense that I know of a few players that moved into Italy, maybe German or British players who moved into Italy with a briefcase full of money, basically saying, we're going to permit some renewables, and then they basically lost everything and ended up leaving with nothing, with a bloody nose, basically. Because actually getting these projects over the line is very, very difficult. But that being said, actually, there is a lot of interest, because look at the rest of the European countries and actually see Spain has prices that are closer to 30 euros per megawatt hour. France is probably more around 50, Germany's around 60, we have 150 today, right? So actually the market remains very attractive, and a lot of players who are in these other countries are trying to move into Italy in some shape or form, right? Particularly, we've seen recently a wave of Spanish EPCs who are basically getting no more work in Spain because the power prices are too low, and so investors don't want to build new projects there anymore, and they're all now trying to move into Italy. So I think the market does remain attractive. I think essentially what happens is that you get players kind of like us, kind of like them, who essentially do development for these other players who say, look, I don't want to get into the weeds and details of having to get these projects permitted. I just want to buy the finished package, and I want to put on my shoes and go, basically. And so there is still quite a lot of movement in the market. The problem is that, exactly as you said, it takes many years to get these projects over the line. There's quite a lot of risk, so when you start the project, you don't actually know. You mostly know if you're going to be able to do it, but you might not really know when. So it's hard to do a long-term planning, and so it remains a risky business. But these projects will always have value, because power generation, now and in the future, is always going to be of great interest to the market.
I complement this with if you look at how the renewable installed capacity is divided among the largest asset manager are all in Italy.
Yeah.
KKR and others of that level. They manage billions, and they're all in Italy, and they did a lot of investment in Italy. JP Morgan, all of them. So I think structurally Italy is interesting. because they see how the system is weak because it allows these power prices. Because if you want to reduce the power prices, it's not very difficult. You don't need to be a nuclear scientist to understand that. If you read all the press since the war started recently in Iran, everybody say now is the case for renewables. Now the driver for renewable is not sustainability anymore, it's energy security. And we have all these governments around Europe, nationalist government that support, local. So they're not against EU, but they support these local countries. Country support it, and they all against renewables, and they don't, give the push that will be needed for that, because it sits exactly in their message. Because Italy first, or US first now with Trump, what best than renewables? You're not. We don't have anything in Italy, so no oil, no gas. The only thing that we have is the sun, a little bit of wind, not much. We have available land, so without listening to what Confagricoltura and all the others are saying, we have a lot of land that is unused, and we can develop solar there. So, you don't need to be an imperial graduate to understand that. I'm pretty sure many in Italy would understand that.
Yeah.
But if there isn't the political will, there isn't.
Of course.
So,
I would just like to add one point to that. I completely agree, and I'm very curious to see what's going to happen over these with this geopolitical crisis, because I think the turning point is going to be when people really start to feel the pain in their wallets, right? Because so far in Italy, for some reason, power prices have never been a mainstream political issue, right? So, in the UK, people revolt when their energy bills get too high, and we seem to be completely comfortable with it. But I think that this time it might be different, because if people see the price of gasoline go up enough, I think that might start to get people to think differently. And if the government starts to see short-term impact in their polling numbers, then that might start to lead to a change.
I'd like now to turn to the technological side of the energy transition. Switching from energy supply from traditional technologies to renewables means transitioning to a supply-driven generation model. Energy must be captured when it is available, and this introduces an additional but critical need, which is storage. Batteries have been, as we said, one of the most discussed and almost idolized technologies in the recent years, yet the rollout of renewables, particularly in countries like Italy, still seems constrained due to the availability of storage systems. What is your view on batteries, and do you think other technologies might ultimately prove more viable, or do you believe batteries will maintain and consolidate their dominance?
Should I go? Yeah, okay. Refrigeration was probably one of the greatest revolutions of the modern age, right? In the sense that before refrigeration, everyone was forced to eat local, right? Because obviously you couldn't transport food. And since doing that, we basically unlocked loads of potential, and even letting that food last longer. And I think storage is essentially that same moment that the agriculture industry faced with refrigeration, in the sense that suddenly you're no longer bound to consuming power in the times and locations where it's being produced, right? Which is a really, really big deal. And now we're going to start to see across the world what impact this technology is going to have on power markets. We're already starting to see how, there's the famous duck curve, right, of power prices, which is when in the middle of the day when solar is producing the most, you see power prices drop. Actually, we're starting to see that in jurisdictions where storage is being deployed at scale, slowly that curve is starting to flatten out, and we're probably going to see more of this as time goes on. So I think storage is absolutely essential, because we are moving from a model where energy is being demand-driven to being supply-driven, and otherwise all you have to do is you have to essentially throw away those electrons, that energy that you've produced. In terms of technologies, I think probably battery storage is likely to be the main winner, because the alternatives will tend to be there are alternatives to battery storage, by the way. It doesn't have to be batteries. Like, you can use reservoirs. There was, I actually met an engineer who was given a task by a comune in Italy to come up with alternatives to battery storage, because they wanted storage, but they didn't want batteries. So he came up with something about, moving sand up and down the thing. And you can do these things, but they're quite geographically dependent, so you need to have the available natural resources nearby to be able to do it, whereas a battery is just a storage container that you put down on a piece of land, you connect it to the grid, and it's just much easier. But regardless of what technology we'll be using, storage is 100% here to stay, and it's only going to become a much bigger part of the energy transition.
There was the missing link, as I mentioned before. We had the generation. We cannot continue to build complex and very difficult to permit as well grid infrastructure. It could take years, because you don't have opposition only to solar and wind. You have opposition also to electric lines, because people don't want them. So they still want to access the internet, they want everything, but
They just don't want the lines.
Exactly. So, and it's cheaper now with the cost decrease to implement batteries. So, which will be the battery of the future? We don't know yet. So, at the moment, it's lithium based, but there are different alternatives that are being studied. And again, I think if the trend is electrification, there will be economies of scale. There will be, this crossover effect between stationary storage and storage for mobility.
Yeah.
So that will drive costs down, and there will be still need for the implementation of green infrastructure, but not as much with the help of the batteries. And this is where, connecting to what we were saying before, is where I can see Europe still having a role, potentially. Not on generation, but definitely on storage.
Yeah, I would like actually to proceed in that. So, I know both of your companies are obviously implementing solutions with storage, and you have projects with storage embedded, you have BESS, just BESS only, and also BESS embedded projects. But what I'm thinking is something that you just briefly mentioned, which is, for example, V2G solution, so vehicle to the grid solution. And do you think, my question would be, do you think that at some point the boundary between producer and consumer will disappear basically, and it will always be that you consume and then you re-input in the grid at some point, and that is beneficial for you, for the grid, for the producers, and for everyone, and maybe just like on the batteries thing itself, how do you see lithium dominating, and do you think that that is the actual technology that will keep lowering the cost, or do you see, I don't know, we see a lot of solid state now, we see a lot of that going around, especially like in conferences and research papers. But yeah, my main two questions were on the type of battery and whether the battery will be something stationary or will be something that at some point will move as well.
So the main issue is, and you ask utilities, who owns the customer? So there will be such a strong resistance from utilities and the independent power producers to give away that. That's not a concept only for energy. The sort of peer-to-peer is a concept that comes from the internet and all of that. I think it will have a role, but it will need to be imposed by the regulator. I don't see a sort of market shift toward that model. You need help.
It's more legislation driven.
Yes, yes. And everybody's saying that solid state will change the sector. So I was in the US last year, and all of them are placing bets on solid state. Also to overcome the issue of rare earth. That is one of the Trump's issues with China, because the reserves are mostly there.
Yes.
So controlling that controls access to the technology. So they want to diversify from that, and solid state is one of the answers.
I don't have much to add on the batteries because I agree. In terms of the self-consumption, I think if you look at Italy, they are doing quite a lot to try to incentivize local production and consumption of energy. So there's like one model that they're using, which is the comunità energetica, so energy communities, basically, where you get quite substantial financial incentives to have, for small-sized solar farms, or sorry, I think actually it's energy generation in general. But if it's small-sized, you basically get some incentives to, not go through long distance distribution, instead to make sure that it's distributed locally, because it actually takes quite a lot of pressure off of the grid. That being said, this still ends up being semi-institutional players investing in energy communities, selling to consumers. And to be honest, I think that model is going to stay anyways, because as we said, it's hard to get these projects permitted, it's expensive to get them built, then you have to manage them. It's difficult to see a future where everyone is going to have their own sort of little power plant, especially because if you look at what you can actually easily install on a roof, for instance, it's usually not enough to cover a family's like full domestic energy domestic use, right? In some cases it is, in some situations, but definitely not in the city, So it's going to be interesting to see where this develops. But I do think, we have gone from a model maybe in the last century where it was centralized production and decentralized distribution, and now it's shifting more and more towards this decentralized production and decentralized distribution, which is why the grid needs so many upgrades. Yeah.
I want to integrate on that, thinking about Italy and what he was saying. Italy is it's not like here that is mostly single family houses.
Yeah.
So if you think about how that, I charge at home, I got the rooftop, and then with a battery at home, I can do arbitrage.
Yes.
So I overbuild the batteries on my home because I want to participate the electricity market. So when the battery is full and the price of electricity is high, I want to sell it. In some countries that they have this structure, maybe you can foresee that. In Italy, it's much more difficult because we all live in condos.
Here in the UK at Imperial, I'm saying I hear a lot about this, domestic production and reintegration into the grid. So it is something that I think.
But again, it will be regulatory driven, not market driven.
I understand. I think Julia's next one.
I'd like to shift now to the geopolitical dimension of energy, because obviously energy has increasingly become a geopolitical power asset. Oil and gas, for example, contributed to the enormous growth in many countries in the Middle East, or gas dependency that has been used by Russia to lever as a geopolitical lever. And countries like China that are investing heavily in renewable technologies at a remarkable speed. So the question is, do you think Europe is or will increasingly become marginal in the global energy power balance?
I think there's going to be more and more of a push towards energy independence. I think it's now become clear. It began in 2022 when the war in Ukraine happened and gas prices exploded, and the short-term solution was to try to shift Europe's gas supply out of Russia, and the long-term solution was to double down on the investment in renewables, right? Because essentially, we are a society now. If you compare our energy consumption now versus, for instance, World War II, we have a much higher rate of energy consumption. I was actually reading, it's quite interesting. Italy during World War II was actually greener than it is now, because most of our power came from the hydro plants, right? And actually, maybe it wasn't that green, but most people were heating their homes with wood, right? And now everyone has phones, computers, whatever you want, electric appliances. And we have so much more heavy industry. We have so much more energy consumption around, and to be exposed to these geopolitically exposed energy supply chains is a very strong security issue, as we were saying earlier. So I think there's going to just after this most recent crisis, there's going to be even more of a push towards energy independence, because otherwise, it has very dire consequences for the entire economic supply chain. The inflationary shock, I'm willing to bet now that the inflationary shock from the recent geopolitical events in Iran is going to be felt very sharply and for a very long time by all the countries that are exposed to that supply chain.
So if we look at the countries that you mentioned, I was looking at the numbers from for China. So essentially, almost half of the GDP growth in China depends on clean technology. So if you leave that sector out, it becomes almost a normal country in terms of growth rate. So they made that strategic decision. Unfortunately, I think there will be. I don't see the European Union having a unified response. Everybody's going on his own. That's the dream world for Russia, for China, and for the US, because that's what they want. If you haven't read even a summary of the Draghi report, is very illuminating on that. That's what we would need. I totally agree on the energy chapter written by his team. So, but I don't see that happening. We need a more unified Europe in order to maintain, the social level that we have, the welfare that every country around the world envy us for that. But we took it for granted, We thought that, that's our standard way of living, and what our fathers and grandfathers, they conquered it for us. And we need to fight back and try to. The good news is that your generation has started with the concept of Europe. So I've I have faith in the new generation, and I think starting from Erasmus, but I see the young generation feeling European. When you talk to maybe my father or that generation, they're Italians. They're essentially Italians, but your generation is profoundly European, and that gives me hope that you can give the right answer, voting the right people. As soon as I don't want to sound, but eventually old people will die. So, and then you will be in charge. So I'm confident that the young generation will have this power to change and provide Europe with a more unified response to this challenge and the other challenges that we will foresee in the future.
Yeah, you predicted perfectly my next question, which was, do we need a more unified Europe or to catch up, with countries like China, as you were saying. But so I'll just move on to the last.
No. I think it's interesting, because that's the dream world for the rest of the world. Yeah, I mean, what's the only thing that India, China, Russia, US have in common? A divided Europe. For them, it's a dream world because they have access to the single markets, but they don't have a strong competitor on every sector, and it's not only energy. So again, I mean, I don't feel myself like a rocket scientist. It's like common sense. So, for obviously Italy is not a young country anymore, but I think the young generation, especially you, that can be the new
the leaders of the transformation.
Yeah. So,
I hope so.
I think you can give a great contribution to that. But this is the main challenge for Europe because seeing how Asia is growing. I just sent one of my employees from Italy to Vietnam, and he's perfectly happy. He's very happy to be in a growing country. You feel the growth buzz all around you. Young generation, and it goes fast. When you're in Ho Chi Minh City, you feel like you're in New York, you're in London at the peak time. How fast they travel, and there's a lot of ecosystems that on technology, on everything, and they're hungry. We're not hungry anymore. They wake up at 4:30. They have 3 jobs, and they're happy. My first employee in Vietnam had the shoes when he was 14, the first shoes. So you can imagine how hungry they are.
Yeah, of course, they want to.
I see it with my kids, they're not hungry.
It's not the first time I hear it. You know, around our generation, a lot of people say you need to wake up again.
Yeah.
And try to move forward with something.
It's a different type of war, but you know, it's a war now, and Europe united for me can be the best place to live in the world. But otherwise, if we go back to a divided Europe, they're gonna eat us.
Of course, that makes sense.
I mean, I have very little to add. Honestly, I completely agree. Europe needs to be united. My dad actually always said what saves Italy is the fact that we're in Europe, and that's absolutely true. You know, I think as a European Union, we all have our own little quirks, but I think together, actually, there is the chance to make something that's greater than the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And unfortunately, I agree that we've become very soft. But I also like to hold out hope for maybe not for me, but maybe the younger people than me too, to carry on this torch.
Perfect. I think we're gonna just have the last two questions and then we can move through the Q&A. My last question on this is more of well, we touched it a bit before as well. It's energy security.
Mm-hmm.
So especially recently, we've seen a lot of moments where in countries that where renewables are the main technology, like Spain, like I think it was Chile, if I'm not wrong, and the UK as well. They had some energy blackouts, and issues related to inertia of the grid or anything that can happen. And my question is, do you think that these events have a magnitude that is large enough to impact the image of renewables within the general public, or whatever we see as people that have a say on renewable energies?
So these were episodes. For instance, the grid in Spain was not prepared for that. The UK has a grid that is ancient, is like the US. So this is why they are at the forefront of storage development, because they need that. They cannot build enough grid infrastructure and modernize that. So Italy has a very good grid, very modern, is one of the examples around the world. Unfortunately, Terna doesn't want to go out of Italy, because I've asked them many times, to participate to public tenders in Vietnam, for instance.
They don't want to.
Not interested.
Why?
Because it's very difficult to go out of Italy. For Italian companies, it's extremely difficult. I mean, if you look at our sector, I found Spanish company everywhere.
Yeah, that's
everywhere. I mean, if it's not ENI or NL, we are the only one in abroad.
And they're buying a lot of other suppliers as well.
So, and the other thing is that the narrative has changed in general completely after COVID. So now it's all short-termism. So it's all about economics. So there's no long-term view on that, and the budget that the oil and gas industry has. I was reading. I was for this debate. I was trying to find the number. They have 2.5 billion profits per day. I mean, this is a war machine that you can't compete with.
Yeah, of course.
So, and there is this because if you talk to normal people in Italy, they're very they absorb a lot of that, and they are against electric cars because they come from China, where they produce electric cars with coal. So essentially, they want to demonstrate, and I mean, we are challenging Armaroli, that is the director of CNR, and everybody on LinkedIn answers coming from, from an ice cream shop to, that's the level. So, no, I think it's, we are resilient. To be in this sector, we need to be resilient, and the sector is very resilient. So, is anti-cyclical. So I think you need to be patient and resilient, but we'll get there. Bumps on the road, but we will get there.
Yeah, I mean, the blackout in Spain was really, really interesting to observe, because first of all, it was like no grid had ever had a blackout before, and suddenly it was all the fault of renewables, right? There have been blackouts throughout the history of electricity, so, you know, and it was really interesting to then read the commentary, especially like I spent a lot of time on Substack, and there's a lot of these publications that do quite deep energy analysis, right? And it's so interesting because the ones that are pro-renewable basically said, oh, you know, it was just a structural issue with Spain's grid and so on. And instead, the ones that were anti-renewable were very much, oh, it was the solar's fault because solar does, you know. And actually then when the final report came out, it was a little bit of both, right? So there was an issue with solar, I don't remember exactly the details, but there was something that went wrong with the solar farm, and then there was some structural issues with the grid and so on, and it ended up in a completely normal event that happens every now and again when you're managing such large-scale infrastructure. So, I mean, the question then becomes, again, this image issue that we were discussing where, you know, there are, I completely agree, some vested interests with some very big budgets, bigger than our budgets, which have been doing a fairly consistent campaign to try to, you know, essentially point out maybe these flaws or these issues with the green transition. But what I'm confident in is that ultimately the economics will win, right? Because ultimately what we're looking at is some institutionalized and structural players that derive outsized profits from the sale of energy from these sources, and then other players actually that are now getting into that have been getting into the sector over the last 2 decades, who are actually able to deliver the exact same electrons for essentially a marginal cost of zero, which in our current energy system means that this is going to be consistently bringing down the power prices. And how can you, as a country as a whole, such as Italy, when you have paying power prices, which were today at 150 euros per megawatt hour, how can you continue to invest and support that technology when it's actually eating away at the competitiveness of the entire economy, right? And I have actually direct evidence of this, which is that I spoke to a politician from I can't remember which region, but it was one of the south ones, who was telling me that they had a car manufacturer decline to build a car manufacturing plant in the region because they said, I can just go to Spain and do the exact same work within the EU framework, spending less than a third for the energy, right? And that actually is a huge differentiator, right? And so what are we going to do? Are we just going to keep trying to give money to fossil fuel companies just to make them happy? Or actually is the broader economy maybe the more important element?
I'd like to end with one final question that might be useful for the students present in the room today, which is, what advice would you give to your younger self as students so that we can inspire the younger minds?
How many people here want to get into energy? Okay, just one. Okay, okay. Well, then you should get into energy. That's the advice that I would give. No, but seriously, I mean, you know, I mean. It was a while ago, not that long ago, that I was looking for my first job when I was still here. And I remember how difficult it was at the time, and I imagine it's only much more complex now, especially if you're trying to get into finance or consulting. It was really, really tough, and I don't want to go through that again, honestly. But at the time, I was much more focused on sort of getting a foot through the door in these sectors, which were the sectors that you kind of had to get into. But if I were to do it again now, I mean, probably I would want to move more towards energy, because actually, or at least in the energy serving side of these sectors, purely because, I mean, if you look at how much there is to do on a global level, if you get a foot in the door through in that avenue, you essentially have the rest of your career ahead of you. You know, energy is only going to become a bigger and bigger and bigger problem as time goes on. You know, if we do make AI happen the way people say we do, but even if we don't, and we do the electrification as we say we're going to do, and then even if we don't do that, but then even if we do all the renewables deployment as we say that we're going to do, there are just so many drivers that are going to lead to so much growth and investment in the sector that basically it's a high-paying job for life. Well, I don't know about high-paying, but job for life, for sure.
If you don't work in Italy.
If you don't work in Italy, correct.
I mean, you're in a very lucky position. I mean, I don't have to give you advice. You're privileged to be able to study at such prestigious university. So you have a very promising future ahead of you in every sector, not only in energy. So if you're here, that means that you don't need advice, because you already have a first great milestone in your life. And so energy definitely is an interesting sector, and it will become even more interesting with this connection to other sectors that we discussed before. So when the world will be electrified, there will be this opportunity of peer-to-peer electricity, all of that. So I think could be engineering, could be finance, could be management. There are loads of opportunities, and then obviously when the capacity will be installed, so the role of development will be finished in Europe, there will still be Asia and Africa that still need to be electrified. So an international career will be lasting for a very long time. But I don't have to teach you anything. If you're here, that means that you're good enough to make good choices.
Thank you. I think we have time for a question from you, if you have any. Maybe let's start from there. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It's fine.
Sure.
Like assuming from, let's say, an optimistic point of view that our generation will be able to, let's say, unify Europe and get more unified Europe in this sense, what do you think that would be the changes needed from this point of view of energy, like to be able to compete with the US, with China, and with the great powers, assuming, of course, that we have more unified Europe?
Again, I go back to the Draghi report. I mean, he has all the answers. So first thing, transitional period now, single buyer of gas. I mean, what's the point of Italy going to Qatar and they buy a little bit, then another country buying a single unified buyer? You lower the cost for all of Europe. That's the first step. Then harmonizing, the European grid. There's a lot of talk, and it's advancing the Asian grid. I don't understand why this concept is not. You still have people talking about powering Europe from North Africa. So where's the energy security? I mean, you need a sub, a Russian sub cutting the cable. That's it. I mean. And then, going forward, having more of a unified approach towards integration of the networks, because now you don't have a single European network. You have the different networks that are connected, but we are going there at a speed that is not consistent with our needs, essentially. The critics of the European Union say something right. I mean, the bureaucracy is there. It takes too long because all this structure was based when in the 50s they created Europe. Now we are 27 countries. So you have to wait until Hungary votes in favor of something. No, otherwise we don't give you the money. So less consensus-based and more pragmatic.
Thank you.
I agree with everything, and I think on the technical points, I have nothing to add. I would just say, big picture, the big disadvantage that Europe as a market has versus the US or China is the fact that we are a limited geography with an extremely fragmented legal structure, right? So as in, you go in Italy, it's one set of laws. You go in France and Germany, it's sort of tied at a European level, but they're completely different markets, right? Whereas you go to the US and you have this huge, vast landscape, which is all, you want to invest in the state of New York. It's fundamentally the same as investing in the state of California, right? With some differences. And that's a really, really big disadvantage, which means that, it's very difficult for a company to develop and grow within the European framework relative to growing within the US or even in China. And I'm not really sure that we're going to end up with like a fully federalized legal system in Europe. Maybe we are, who knows? But I think that if that's one of the big barriers to the competition, I would say.
Perfect. I think we can close it here. And yeah, I would like to thank you.
There was another question, no?
I mean, if we have time, I'll just be quick. So, I mean, you've mentioned that there were some like big asset managers and investment banks that pour some funds in Italy in renewable projects. But I mean, you've talked about how the return on investment is more long term and it requires some sort of like significant capex investment. So my question is, in Italy, where do you get the money from? Like, what are the instruments? Are like normal banks, I don't know, Intesa San Paolo, UniCredit, the viable options with their options, or do you go to venture capitalists or private equity funds?
So for assets, the debt market in Italy is very liquid. There are all the major European banks, Italian banks are able to fund your construction, so that's not an issue. If you want to grow as a company, then the financial system in Italy is too provincial. The analogy that I always give is that our last empire was a few thousand years ago. So since then we are a young country because we are not very old as a country, and we are inward looking. Mm-hmm. If you look at the UK, if you look at Spain, they had an empire yesterday. Mm-hmm. So they open to the world. So when you try as an Italian company to go abroad, that's the big challenge. The Italian banks are not prepared. It's the same thing as the level of the bank bureaucrat you're dealing with is not very high, and I'm talking about senior corporate functions in the banking sector. Obviously not top management, but the ones that would fund a company like ours. They don't understand it outside of Italy. They don't. They really don't understand why you're going to look for growth abroad. So there's this dichotomy. We jump-started the business through a venture capital fund in Italy, but we're talking, compared to other markets, very, very limited. That's for me is the biggest drawback in Italy, the provincialism of the financial institutions.
100% agree. I have no notes. The only thing that I would add is that there is lots of liquidity available if you need it. Getting to that liquidity is the complicated part, right? We've seen this as well ourselves in terms of the availability of capital, especially when it comes to the capex. It's a bit easier. You will find many banks and many institutions that are willing to do project finance or something along those lines. When it comes to the DevEx, it's a bit more difficult, especially because now the sector is kind of mature. Everyone who was sort of willing to get that exposure has gotten it, and so it's hard now to find players that are still interested in doing the substantial tickets for let's say the intangible side of the business. But that being said, I mean there is money available. It's a bit harder. It's a lot harder to access than it would be in the UK or in the US, I would say.
DevEx is all private equity. Yeah. You don't. I mean, there's loads of debt available, but that's very risky. That's where many companies fail because they fund their expansion plans only through debt, while DevEx should be equity.
Yeah.
But not many organizations want to take that risk. But the reward is very high returns because you take that risk. So. And there is not that private equity environment in Italy funding that. You can find it in Spain, you can find it in the UK, to a lesser extent other countries in Europe, Germany definitely, but Italy very little.
Perfect. Thank you all for coming. It's very inspiring, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.